Hi! So this is going to be a pretty informal video. Lifetime just recently released a documentary series called Where is Wendy Williams? It was a 4-part series aired over 2 nights, and it largely deals with the mysterious guardianship over Wendy Williams. Now, I'm not an expert in adult guardianships, but I am an expert in Britney Spears. So I haven't been following this case as closely as I followed Britney's, but because I did follow Britney's conservatorship case very closely, I do think that I have more knowledge about guardianships in the US than the average person. And while the average Britney stan probably does know more about guardianships and conservatorships than most people, I do find that a lot of Britney stans who were really active in the Free Britney movement haven't really done that much research into how guardianships and conservatorships work outside of Britney's case. One of the big problems around these kinds of arrangements is the lack of regulation on them and the fact that the legal processes to create and maintain them differ from state to state and even court to court. It's just a complete mess. So I keep seeing people advocating for Wendy Williams' freedom from her guardianship by saying stuff like, this is just like what happened to Britney Spears, and it's really not. There are similarities, some pretty big ones, but there also are some pretty significant differences. And I do think that it's important to highlight some of those differences to emphasize the point that guardianship abuse doesn't just look like one particular thing. Every case deserves to be taken at its own merit. So even though I'm not as knowledgeable on Wendy's case as I am with Britney's, I do want to take this story seriously as its own thing, not just like a spin-off of Britney Spears' story. But of course, there are things that happen to Britney that are representative of larger problems that a lot of guardianships face. So a lot of that is still important to the overall context, but I don't think that where these stories divulge should be overlooked. So I'm going to try to go over the basics of what's happening to Wendy Williams. Starting with background, if you don't know, Wendy Williams is formerly a radio host, like a shock jock kind of personality, turned talk show host of The Wendy Williams Show. She is a controversial but beloved figure, especially on gay Twitter. If you spend enough time on the internet, you've probably at least seen clips of her. And one of the clips that you might have seen was from an episode in 2017 when she was dressed as the Statue of Liberty, and she fainted live on TV. That was kind of the first big incident that got people concerned about Wendy's health, but she explained it by saying that she was dehydrated that day, the outfit was too tight, and she also indicated that she was going through menopause, so she was having hot flashes, and then, under the big hot lights of the studio, it just got too much, and she passed out. It's definitely a scary clip, but it is a reasonable explanation at least. Separately from that though, but around the same time, she also disclosed that she suffers from Graves' disease that can cause hyperthyroidism. It also explains why sometimes her eyes get a little bit bulgy. It has something to do with the pressure that gets put behind her eyes, and other people with Graves' disease. I don't think it's universal for everyone that has it, but it is common. And it also has caused her hair to thin, which is why she wears wigs so much. Along with that, she also suffers from lymphedema, which is something to do with her foot. It makes her foot swell up. She shows it a few times in the Lifetime documentary, and there was also a clip of her showing her foot on a TMZ live. It looks pretty painful. They are very swollen, but she says that it's not painful because she doesn't really have much feeling in her foot anymore, but it does affect her ability to walk. She also experiences vertigo, and previously she's been pretty open about her past struggles with substance abuse. Specifically at the beginning of her career, I know she had a lot of struggles with cocaine. It seems like that has moved on though to now a current struggle with alcohol. So 2019 is where things start to really amp up. So in March, she announced on her show that she had been living in a sober house for a little bit. I'm not sure exactly how long, but it seems like at least for maybe a few weeks or something before she made the announcement she was there. About a week after the announcement, there were some reports about her being hospitalized after she checked herself out of the sober living facility and was found drunk. At this point, the circumstances of everything were kind of mysterious, and she was taking a couple weeks off at a time. I think at one point she took like 2 months off of her show, and it was always explained as some like vague health problems. At one point she fractured her shoulder, and that was to blame, and then there was stuff with like her Graves' disease. So the truthfulness for why she's been gone at certain points is not really anyone's business, but there were just like a lot of questions that people had, especially because around the time that all this was happening, she was also experiencing a lot of problems in her personal life, particularly in her marriage. So again, March of 2019, she said that she had been living in a sober house. April of 2019, she announced that she was divorcing her husband. He had not only been caught cheating on her, but also was expecting a baby with another woman, so bad. A lot of people around her at the time have speculated that the trauma of the divorce and everything going on with that is what sparked her relapse into alcoholism. And then while still dealing with that, there was a pandemic in 2020. She started recording the Wendy Williams show in isolation in her house. The results of that arrangement were notably bizarre, but mostly in like a fun, quirky way. John Oliver even did a segment on his show talking about how weird the Wendy Williams show had gotten with Wendy filming from her house. So things were getting kind of weird, but again, in like a cute way for the most part. But her family has gone on to say that they think that the isolation she faced during the pandemic contributed to her declining mental state. And what's kind of worse than all of that other stuff is that in 2020, Wendy's mother passed away. Wendy was extremely close with her mother, so obviously this was a very big loss. But she took another short hiatus from her show and then came back. At like the end of 2020, the Wendy Williams show went back in front of a live studio audience, but Wendy's behavior was becoming increasingly bizarre. The documentary shows some clips of this. I didn't watch the Wendy Williams show at the time, so I don't know if those clips are taken out of context, or I don't know if it wasn't like as prevalent an issue as the documentary kind of suggests, but even just from the behind the scenes reports from that time, it seems like the situation was pretty bad. There was this big Hollywood Reporter article that came out in August of 2022 talking about the last days of the Wendy Williams show, and a lot of people who were working at it said that her speech was becoming increasingly incoherent, she was experiencing a lot of memory problems, and a big contributing factor to a lot of it seemed to be alcohol. And then in the fall of 2021, Wendy went on hiatus again with press releases saying that she was struggling with something related to Graves' disease and also had contracted COVID-19, so she wasn't going to be hosting the Wendy Williams show for a bit. The Wendy Williams show continued, though. They had a bunch of rotating guest hosts for a couple weeks, especially Sherri Shepherd, who seemed to get really popular with the audience. So then in February of 2022, it was announced first that Wendy was just going to be taking a break from the remainder of that season, and then later that month it was announced that Sherri Shepherd was going to permanently take her spot. While all that's happening with the network, Wendy was in a battle against her bank. So it didn't get reported on until a few days later, but on February 4th, Wendy sent a letter to the court saying that Wells Fargo had been denying her access to her account for about 2 weeks. Wells Fargo said that they had frozen Wendy's accounts after they discovered that she had been subject to undue influence and was being financially exploited by someone else. That someone else turned out to be Wendy's son, Kevin Jr., but we'll get back to that later because that wasn't something people really knew at the time. It was all pretty mysterious. Then in May, a New York court appointed a guardian over Wendy's finances. So this is where the guardianship comes in, is May of 2022. Already, it's pretty different from Britney's conservatorship, at least on the surface. For one thing, Wendy's guardianship was put in place in New York, whereas Britney's was in California, and that does matter because every state is different. But then the most significant difference is the fact that Britney's was a conservatorship over her estate and her person, whereas Wendy's seems to be just over her estate. I say seems because I don't know that much about New York's guardianship laws. I believe, like California, a guardianship over someone's estate and their person is like a different thing. They're related, they go through the same court, but they're separate guardianships. So one could be terminated and not the other, and there could be different guardians appointed for each. What this really means in practice, I don't know. To be honest, I think if you're going to have one over the other, a guardianship over someone's person makes more sense than a guardianship over their estate. Firstly, because I don't know how you argue that someone requires a conservatorship over their estate without arguing that they require one over their person. If they're too incapacitated to manage their finances, wouldn't that imply that they're too incapacitated to do other stuff in their life? And shouldn't you have someone appointed to protect them with that other stuff rather than just focusing on their money? And then also, giving someone control over someone else's finances essentially does give them control over their entire life. Maybe not officially, but if you control how someone can spend their money, you control pretty much the entire circumstances of their living. It almost just seems like giving someone conservatorship over another person's estate and not their life also is just a way to let them control someone else's life without having any sort of responsibility to take care of them. So for me, immediately upon learning that Wendy was in a conservatorship over her estate, or a guardianship as New York calls it was just already a little fishy, especially since Wendy seemed to be fighting a lot of the control that Wells Fargo was already trying to put onto her money. This definitely wasn't like a voluntary thing that Wendy entered into. It was a third party coming in and exerting control. Now, where this overlaps with Britney and where we get into a larger problem about guardianships and conservatorships is that once someone has taken this kind of control over another person's life, they decide who gets to be around that person. And this, again, is especially true with conservatorships over the estate for someone like Britney or Wendy specifically, who have professional teams around them. They have a payroll. They have people that they employ. So by taking control of their estate, you're taking control of whom they employ. And you can ensure that everyone on the payroll reports back to you specifically. It makes it very easy to weed out anyone in that person's life who may not really approve of the control being taken over their loved one. So right after Britney got into her conservatorship, we started seeing some pretty drastic changes in her professional team, especially people that Britney had been close to previously were just suddenly gone or on the outskirts of her career. Britney's longtime assistant Felicia, for instance, was noticed by Britney fans right away to no longer be super close with Britney, but instead was relegated to doing the tours for her Las Vegas residency for fans. It always seemed kind of weird, but then we found out later that Felicia was specifically kept out of Britney's inner circle by her conservatorship. Similarly with Wendy, around the time the guardianship got put into place, she had a new manager, a new publicist, and we've recently found out was completely isolated from her family. Her family lost pretty much all ability to get into contact with her. The person who took over as Wendy's manager is named William Shelby. He does not have a history in management as far as I'm aware. nowhere. He was previously just like a high-end jeweler who helped Wendy get some diamonds or something. I don't want to be too dramatic about it because I don't know that much about Will, but he is giving some slight Sam Lutfi vibes, if you're familiar with Britney's story. But he really starts putting together this idea of a podcast for Wendy now that she's lost her TV show. And that's where this Lifetime documentary comes in. So this podcast had been announced. Wendy had done some promo for it. There was like a photo shoot and everything, and she was talking about doing a podcast. So the head of development at Lifetime reached out to Will to do some sort of like comeback documentary. That was what this documentary was supposed to be. Just something following the production of this podcast and Wendy finding this new career and this new outlet outside of television. Lifetime already has an established history with Wendy. They did a documentary about her in 2021. They also did a biopic about her where she was an executive producer. So there's a very good relationship between Wendy's people and Lifetime's people, even though Wendy's people now is very different. And the producers of the Lifetime documentary have talked about that they weren't used to dealing with these people. This is a whole new team for Wendy. They didn't know anything about the situation going in, and they thought that they were going to make something uplifting. But then they start shooting around August of 2022, and immediately the situation is different from what they were expecting. So if you watch the docuseries, the opening scene of it wasn't really supposed to be in the film. It was really just a development shoot where they were going to get an idea from Wendy about what she wanted to cover throughout the whole thing and just kind of get like the general vibe of everything. But that didn't go well. As you can see in the footage, Wendy's behavior is just kind of erratic and a little odd. It's not really bad. There's one point where she tries to show the producers her boobs, or she asks them if they want to see them. And that part actually is I think kind of cute. But throughout the whole thing, she is crying on and off. Her mood is pretty erratic. She's also really defensive surrounding questions about her alcoholism and substance abuse, which is a pretty significant change from before, where she talked about being an alcoholic or having a cocaine addiction and such. This was something she had acknowledged previously was a struggle for her, and now she's basically saying that it's not a problem and people should just leave her alone. Not something you want to hear from a recovering addict. So they do this scene, they get concerned about what's going on with Wendy, they lose touch with her for a little bit. Her managers tell them later that it was just a bad day for Wendy and that she was going to be put into a treatment facility to take care of the problem. And as far as they know at the time, alcohol is really the only issue. So Wendy goes to rehab for a bit, she gets out, and then they resume filming this documentary. The producers said that when they first resumed filming, Wendy seemed to have improved from the last time they saw her. So again, they're ready to go back into this thinking that it's going to be an uplifting story about her comeback. But of course, that's not what happened. As they continue filming with Wendy, they realize that there is something else going on that's not just alcohol. And at some point during the shoot, they find out from Wendy's family that she's been diagnosed with dementia. I'm not sure exactly how far they got into this shoot before they heard that diagnosis, but it seems like it was a while. And I think it's important to point out that they learn it from Wendy's family, whom she had been isolated from. They are never told this by Wendy's guardian or the team that they had been working on this documentary with. I had to go to work, so I look different now. It wasn't a midday costume change. Anyway, there are some conversations surrounding this docuseries about the potential exploitation of it. Wendy has been diagnosed with dementia, and there are many moments in the series where that is pretty apparent. She wasn't really in a sound state of mind when a lot of this was being made, and a lot of people have made the argument that Once the filmmakers got to the location and realized the situation, they should have just stopped filming. I completely understand that sentiment, but I do disagree. I saw quite a few people online saying that they watched like the first part of the series, but then just stopped because it seemed so gross to them. And in a way, I think Lifetime kind of shot themselves in the foot with this by making it like a 2-night event. Because absolutely the first half of this is pretty rough. Wendy is not doing well, it's incredibly uncomfortable, it's hard to watch. But I implore you, if you started watching the docuseries but you didn't finish it, you should finish it. The second half of the series is kind of what justifies the existence of the first part. And even just watching the first part, I completely understand why the filmmakers made the decisions that they did. Yes, it became apparent to them early on that Wendy wasn't doing well, but it also was apparent that Wendy liked the cameras there. And a lot of her most lucid moments are when she's talking directly to the cameras. There was an interview that the producers did with The Hollywood Reporter where one of them said this: "There was a real emotional connection that the project gave her, and honestly, it got to a point where we were more worried about what would happen to Wendy if we stopped filming than if we continued." And I completely agree with that. There are parts in the series where stuff starts to get pretty intense, and the filmmakers do stop filming. A little note would come up on the screen that was like, as things intensified, the producers decided to pack up for the day, and every time something like that would happen, I always thought, please don't go. And it wasn't because I wanted to watch the scene play out. As nosy of a person as I am, a lot of the stuff in that series is very uncomfortable, and I did not enjoy watching it. But the production crew being there both seemed to ground Wendy a little bit. It gave her like a focal point where she could express herself a little bit more clearly. But then also, the people around Wendy are so shady that I got worried about what was going on when there weren't cameras on them. The fact that there were cameras present gave them some sense of accountability. Now, of course, just because the producers were there filming these things doesn't mean they needed to use all that footage in the actual series. But to that point, they didn't use all the footage. The producers said in that Hollywood Reporter interview that there was footage that was so gnarly that they're just never gonna make it public, and I do believe them. It's not just me taking their word on it, but like watching the series, you definitely get the sense that you're not seeing everything. The producers and the people in that room have definitely seen more than they're showing, and what they've seen is probably worse than what they've shown. How much worse, I don't know, but there's certainly a level of restraint here with what actually made the final cut. Could they have cut out all the unflattering footage that Wendy might not want shown? Yeah, they could have done that, but that would have been really, really dishonest. And yes, that dishonesty would have been a little bit more flattering toward Wendy, but it wouldn't have exposed the situation the way that the series actually did do. To a degree, the producers had to let Wendy exist in a somewhat undignified state on camera to properly show the audience what's happening in her life and what people may or may not be taking advantage of her. So I think this is a very good docuseries. It is very observational, the producers don't do a whole lot of meddling in it at all, and still, it definitely has a perspective. It has commentary from experts on adult guardianships and their potential harms. At various points, you hear the producers expressing concern or even just confusion about the events around them. And even though Wendy isn't at her best, in the second half especially, they do include a lot of statements from people that love her, so it still does kind of feel like a tribute to her and her legacy. I'll get into some of the specific stuff in the documentary in a second, but first we have to talk about what happened about 2 days before it premiered. So right before the documentary, Wendy's people put out a press release announcing that Wendy had been diagnosed with aphasia and dementia. Aphasia is essentially like a rare form of dementia. It mostly affects someone's speech. Bruce Willis was also pretty recently diagnosed with it. But this is the first time that an official diagnosis for Wendy has been made public since the Wendy Williams show went on hiatus. Around the same time, it also came out that Wendy's guardian had filed a lawsuit against Lifetime to try to halt the premiere of the docuseries. Obviously, that lawsuit failed, but I saw a lot of people, especially in the Free Britney community, that were kind of taking this chain of events to try to imply or even outright state that Wendy's people coming forward with this dementia diagnosis was just a calculated effort to undermine anything Wendy said in the series by claiming that she has dementia, and so nothing she said should be taken seriously, with a lot of people doubting that that diagnosis was even real. Now, to some degree, I understand why people were suspicious of the dementia diagnosis. For one thing, Wendy is a little bit younger than a typical dementia patient, and dementia is a really common diagnosis for adult guardianships for both legitimate and illegitimate reasons. Now, obviously, someone that has dementia is kind of like the ideal candidate for a guardianship because it's a progressive illness, it gets worse with time, and especially in its later stages, it will severely impair the person that it affects. Someone with dementia will eventually require help. So, reasonably, a lot of people with dementia end up in guardianships. That being said, if you are someone who is looking to put someone into a guardianship against their will illegitimately, getting them diagnosed with dementia, whether or not they actually have it, is one of the best ways to ensure that you have maximum control over that person and that the guardianship will exist pretty much until they die. Again, because dementia is a progressive illness, it's different from other disorders like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, because those are things that can get better with treatment. Someone who gets put into a guardianship because they have bipolar could find ways to manage their symptoms to the point that they no longer require a guardianship. If you get put under a guardianship for dementia, the expectation is that you're not gonna get better, you're gonna get worse. That legal arrangement, therefore, becomes almost impossible to get out of. And at least in certain states, including California, because that's the one that I'm the most familiar with, a dementia diagnosis can get the conservators something referred to as dementia powers. So normally in a California probate conservatorship, a conservator doesn't have the right to force any sort of treatment onto their conservatee. If you want to force someone to take a specific kind of medication or put them into a treatment facility, you have to get an LPS conservatorship, but someone with dementia can't be put into an LPS conservatorship because that kind of arrangement is specifically meant for treatment with the expectation that the conservatee will get better and then get out. LPS conservatorships only last a year maximum. A probate conservatorship, though, even if it starts temporary, will usually get made permanent. You can't force a conservatee in those arrangements to get any specific kind of treatment unless that person has dementia, and then the judge will often allow the conservators to take additional control. This is likely how Britney's conservators were able to get away with putting her into a mental health facility and forcing her to take specific medication against her will, even though, technically, conservators are only able to do that sort of thing if the treatment they're putting their conservatee in is specifically for dementia. And with what we know about Britney's treatment, it seems more like they were trying to treat something closer to like bipolar disorder. So it still doesn't really make any sense. But Britney was technically diagnosed with dementia at the start of her conservatorship. That diagnosis is almost certainly illegitimate. Britney was 26 at the time, which would make a dementia diagnosis incredibly unlikely. Her symptoms never seemed to progress after 2008 during the conservatorship. She was still working, she was still a public figure, and also even if you just look back to 2008, the timeline of events for how she got this diagnosis in the first place just really does not make sense. I'm not going to go into all the details of that right now, but from a Free Britney perspective, there is reason to find a dementia diagnosis for a guardianship a little sus. But this is where I get pretty frustrated with a lot of Free Britney people who, while talking about other public figures' battles with guardianships and conservatorships, often overemphasize the similarities to Britney's case. For instance, because Britney was put into a conservatorship directly after a 5150, now any time that another celebrity gets 5150'd or even just experiences some evident mental health crisis, a certain section of the Britney fandom will start pushing some conspiracy theories about how that celebrity is being set up. Like one of the worst that I saw was when Kanye West was having a pretty public mental breakdown, and there were people on Twitter saying that the media was trying to make him look crazy so they could do to Kanye what they did to Britney. Like, sometimes there are people struggling with their mental health, and there's no puppet master pulling the strings for that. That rhetoric already trivializes mental illness by treating every diagnosis like it's a part of some conspiratorial plot, but it's also really unproductive to anti-guardianship movements. There's like this inclination from some people in the Free Britney movement to challenge the ethics of a guardianship by just insisting that the person at the center of it is completely fine. This happened a lot when people were talking about Amanda Bynes' conservatorship. People being like, oh, because Amanda tweeted once that Drake should murder her vagina, now she's in a conservatorship. Ignoring the fact that Amanda was also tweeting that her father had implanted a chip in her brain and at one point took a can of gasoline and lit a stranger's driveway on fire, while also briefly lighting herself and her dog on fire on accident. Now, both Amanda and the dog were fine, but clearly Amanda was struggling with her mental health more than just thinking that Drake should murder her vagina. There was reason for people to think that she was a potential danger to herself or others. Some amount of intervention probably was necessary for her at one point. You can admit that while also still criticizing her conservatorship. I've never seen any evidence that Amanda's family was acting with malice when they put her under a conservatorship. But I have seen evidence that the way they went about creating and then overseeing that conservatorship was really irresponsible and potentially more harmful toward Amanda than helpful. We have to be honest about the nuances of these cases instead of painting everything with this broad brush of like, so-and-so doesn't actually have the mental illness people claim they have. So-and-so's guardians are evil human traffickers. Therefore, so-and-so's guardianship is bad. Even in Britney's case, the lack of nuance in the public conception of her conservatorship is actively hurting her. Britney almost certainly did not have dementia, but she probably was struggling with some sort of mental health issue. And even by her own admission, she is still struggling after the conservatorship ended. By denying that, we've just given people ammo to claim that Britney's conservatorship was actually good the whole time anytime she displays any sort of unusual behavior. Like I saw that Andrew Schultz idiot at one point saying that we all owe Jamie Spears an apology because Britney's Instagram content is kinda weird. And no. Like, if you're one of those people that's really concerned about the video of Britney dancing in her living room with knives, I'm gonna need you to go back and look at what her conservators were having her do during the conservatorship and recognize that the same woman who you think is too unwell to be trusted with knives was doing far more dangerous stunts for photo shoots, for music videos, for live shows, all under her conservator's care. I've never seen any evidence that Britney qualified for a conservatorship to begin with, but I don't know her personally, and maybe there was other stuff happening at the time that did qualify her for a conservatorship. Even if we accept that that was true, that the inception of the conservatorship was made on reasonable and lawful grounds, that does not erase the abuse she faced within it. The initial reluctance to say that Wendy Williams probably has dementia seems to be built around this same idea that we can't advocate to free Wendy unless we've decided that she's not incapacitated. And I assure you, we can. And this is kind of why I think the filmmakers did need to include some unflattering footage of Wendy experiencing a mental health crisis. When I first saw the report about Wendy having dementia, I was like, who knows? Now, having watched the docuseries, I don't really have any doubt she does have dementia. Now, her son says it was alcohol-induced, which would make sense for why the symptoms started to show up relatively young for her, but the diagnosis is never used in the film to defend the guardianship. In fact, it's kind of presented as the primary reason to condemn the guardian. I do definitely think that the prior announcement of Wendy's diagnosis by her team was done in an effort to undermine the documentary a bit. Not to undermine anything Wendy said in it, but just to get ahead of the story and take the wind out of the sails for the filmmakers. This diagnosis does not make her guardianship look good. Because whatever you think about the filmmakers possibly exploiting Wendy at a vulnerable time, remember that they went into this situation not knowing Wendy's diagnosis. Wendy's guardian, on the other hand, knew the state she was in and signed off on this documentary going forward. You can think of the producers as slimy for the way that they handled the situation, but ultimately, they are just filmmakers trying to put together a few hours of television. They work for Lifetime. They don't really owe Wendy anything. Wendy's guardian, on the other hand, is legally accountable for her, and she knowingly put Wendy into a situation where she could be exploited. And the documentary is the least of that problem. So if you watch the series, one of the first things talked about is the fact that Wendy and her team were still trying to get this podcast thing going. She was doing photo shoots, meeting with people. She also did some meetings with TV executives to try to get a TV show going again, all while she is pretty clearly still struggling mentally. And that's why I think it's pretty important to still show some of Wendy's bad moments. If they cut around it and always tried to show the most flattering footage of her, it would not have been so obvious that the people on her management team don't really care about her as a person. They just want her to keep working. I had to go to work again. Boo! Anyway. The presence of Wendy's guardianship kind of looms over the whole thing, despite the fact that the guardian is never actually in the docuseries at all. The producers have even stated that they never had much direct contact with her. They were mostly communicating to her through Will. And when they were making the series, the name of the guardian wasn't public yet, so her name doesn't actually appear in the series either. Every time she's mentioned, her name is censored, but we do now know that her name is Sabrina Morrissey. I still don't know much about her, but that's her name. So she's never in the series at all, but she is mentioned quite a bit, and Will always seems pretty concerned about what she is or isn't gonna approve of Wendy doing. And this is where I have to go back to 2 points I made before. One is that Wendy's team seems to have a pretty firm allegiance to her guardian, and that makes sense considering Sabrina is the one who decides who stays on Wendy's payroll. They have a financial incentive to work work for the guardianship's benefit. And it doesn't seem like Wendy has a whole lot of people in her inner circle that aren't being paid. She even mentions it at one point, that she has no real friends, she just has employees. And Wendy's family has found it next to impossible to even get into contact with Wendy without the guardian's approval. This is a big part of pretty much all instances of guardianship abuse. Isolation. Everyone around her is an agent for a guardianship she does not want to be in. And still, the guardian herself is barely around. That brings me back to my second point. If we've decided that Wendy Williams is genuinely incapacitated enough to require a guardianship, and I do think she is at least in episodes, how is her guardian able to take complete control of her finances without being required to provide Wendy a round-the-clock caretaker? I do not understand the logic of giving someone a guardianship over the estate and not over the person. Sure, Wendy might need some help right now, but if she's so not capable of taking care of herself, why is her guardian never around? Why does she exist as this spectral presence that takes complete control over Wendy's life while never being there to oversee her day-to-day care? Moreover, why is Wendy's money, which again is controlled by her guardianship, being used to employ a manager and a publicist instead of something like a stay-at-home nurse? It is very clear that there is no one taking care of Wendy on a daily basis. At one point in the docuseries, it's revealed that there's barely any food in her fridge. She is also very not sober. Now, her manager, Will, supposedly is trying to keep her sober. There's a scene where at one point Will tells a waiter at a restaurant not to bring Wendy any alcohol, no matter what she orders. There's a part where he confronts Wendy with a half-drank bottle of liquor that was hidden in her home. And he also tells the cameras that whenever he finds alcohol in her house, he pours it down the sink. Now, I hate to be overly skeptical here, but I do have to wonder if some of that is a complete front for the camera. It's not that I think that Will is out getting Wendy alcohol. I don't think he is, and he maybe would even prefer it if she was sober. But if it was such a huge priority to him, I just don't think keeping Wendy sober would be that hard. Yes, she is insistent about her desire to continue consuming alcohol, but she openly says that she doesn't have access to her own money. And because of her very swollen feet, she can't walk long distances without assistance. If Will keeps finding alcohol in her house, how did it get there? Someone has to be helping her get it. And the alcohol thing is particularly upsetting considering the claim that Wendy's dementia was alcohol-induced. Normally, dementia is a progressive illness that once the symptoms show up, they persist and they eventually get worse. However, with alcohol-induced dementia, the symptoms can be reversed if you start treating it immediately. And that treatment requires sobriety. It's not a guarantee that the symptoms would go away if Wendy stopped drinking, but it is a possibility. And the more and more she drinks, the closer she gets to a point of no return where dementia is just going to keep progressing whether she stays sober or not. Especially in the early stages, keeping Wendy sober should have been the number one priority of her guardian. But it doesn't seem like it's a huge priority of her team. Will at least acts like he cares about Wendy's sobriety. Whether or not he's doing enough to promote it, I find very suspicious. But Sean, Wendy's publicist, seems to openly not give a shit. In the interviews with the producers of the docuseries, she downplays the issue, saying things like, Wendy knows her limits, and it's not a problem as long as she doesn't get too drunk. And I understand to a degree that spin is a part of her job as a publicist. Her getting on camera and saying, yeah, it's a really big deal and we're all worried about her wouldn't be a smart move from a business decision. Of course, neither would this documentary, but Wendy's team went ahead with that anyway. But it's clearly not just spin, because there's a scene where she takes Wendy to lunch and lets Wendy order a glass of wine. And I don't know if she's just that uncaring, that she doesn't give a shit that if Wendy keeps drinking, the symptoms of her dementia are gonna get worse, or if she's just ridiculously naive and stupid. Either way, I don't know why her inclusion in Wendy's inner circle is at all okay according to her guardian. Now, for the record, according to the interview that the producers for the series did with The Hollywood Reporter, Sean is no longer a part of Wendy's team. But even if Wendy's guardian had the sense to fire her eventually, it doesn't change the fact that she was on Wendy's team for months at least, while Wendy was supposedly too incapacitated to care for herself. Again, if that were the case, why is Wendy's money being used to hire a publicist at all? You would think there were bigger priorities in her life. And why is her publicist openly saying that Wendy doesn't have an issue with alcoholism when her guardian very much knows that she does? There are two possibilities here for why alcoholism isn't being taken more seriously by the guardianship. One is that they just don't care. Wendy's health is not a priority to them. That's the better option. Or two, since the dementia symptoms are affected by Wendy's alcohol consumption, it kind of benefits her guardian by her not being sober. The more Wendy's dementia progresses, the easier it is to argue that she is incapacitated and the guardianship needs to continue indefinitely. If you control enough of a person's life, you control the circumstances that make the symptoms of whatever is supposedly incapacitating them more or less obvious. From a business standpoint, they need to downplay Wendy's issues so that any future business ventures she does doesn't seem as icky, but from a legal standpoint, the worse Wendy gets, the more control they get to assert. Now, prior to the guardianship, around the fall of 2021, right before and around the time that Wendy starts having issues with Wells Fargo, she was supposedly getting sober while in Miami with her family. Her son was the person primarily taking care of her. He was spending her money, he says, with her permission and primarily on her care. I do believe Wendy's son because in the docuseries, Wendy has nothing but good things to say of him. And she says of her own accord that all of her money is for him. When she dies, he is the only person entitled to anything from her estate. So even if I thought that Wendy's son was using her money for his own benefit, according to Wendy, it's pretty much all his anyway. That is her unwavering stance on the matter. Wells Fargo, however, decided that she was being exploited by her son, and that is why they froze her accounts. So when all that stuff started happening, Wendy did give her son durable power of attorney. What this means is that Wendy signed an agreement where she maintained most of her civil rights except in instances in which she's incapacitated. In those instances, her son would essentially act as a legal agent for her. He was in charge of paying her bills, managing her assets. He could also be involved in decision-making for her health care. A power of attorney agreement is essentially a less restrictive form of guardianship, and it's especially helpful for people with dementia whose disabled status is going to be episodic. The big problem with these kinds of arrangements is that they can be overturned pretty easily, especially through the inception of a guardianship. If it's decided that someone was subject to undue influence when they signed the power of attorney agreement, or if it's just decided that the person they gave power of attorney to is not doing a good job overseeing that person's life or estate, it can be overturned. And that is what happened to Wendy Williams. A New York court decided that Wendy had not been capable of signing that agreement with her son, so the guardianship was put into place. Her family stayed in Miami, she went back to New York, and her family has been almost completely cut out of her life ever since. Not at Wendy's request, but at the discretion of her guardian. Currently, Wendy is in some sort of treatment facility, but no one really knows where. And not only has her family been shut out, the producers of the Lifetime documentary have said that they haven't been able to contact her since April of last year. So there's still a lot of mystery around Wendy's situation, but I'll finish this video with a couple points that I think are important to emphasize about guardianships and conservatorships overall. The laws around these kinds of arrangements are all kinds of corrupt. The legal processes involved deserve every bit of scrutiny that they've gotten from the Free Britney movement, but that doesn't mean that every individual conservatorship or guardianship is bad. With such a lack of oversight over this system, how helpful or exploitative each arrangement is fully dependent on the people directly involved. Just the fact that someone files for a guardianship over someone doesn't mean they're trying to take advantage of that person. It just means that they might be, and the courts overseeing those cases aren't doing enough to ensure that that's not what's happening. Recently, Cher filed for a conservatorship over her son. She has so far been unsuccessful in getting that arrangement put in place. And I want to be clear first off that from what I know about that case, I don't support Cher's decision. I think that with the relationship that she and her son have had historically, that she should not be trying to insert herself into this kind of role in his life. But that doesn't mean that Cher wasn't well-intentioned when she filed, and it doesn't mean that she isn't trying to help her son, whom she genuinely cares about. And I saw a lot of people online at the time saying things like, if she wants to help him, why doesn't she try to get a power of attorney agreement or something less restrictive than a conservatorship? And I don't know what specifically was going through Cher's head and what her decision-making process was like, but let's remember again that a power of attorney agreement can be very, very easily overturned, where a guardianship cannot. Nichelle Nichols had a power of attorney agreement before she got put into a conservatorship. Casey Kasem had a power of attorney agreement that got overturned by a different advanced planning agreement for his estate, and then that also got overturned by a guardianship. And Wendy Williams as well had a power of attorney agreement that got overturned with a guardianship. Guardianships are ridiculously hard to get terminated, which means that if you do have an incapacitated loved one and you're worried that someone else is going to try to take advantage of them, it makes sense that you would seek a guardianship or a conservatorship over that person, because if you don't, someone else might. And if someone else succeeds and they don't have your loved one's best interest at heart, you're kind of fucked after that. And this is the catch-22 with these arrangements. On one hand, because of a lack of oversight and the amount of control that a guardian can take over their ward, I don't think these kinds of arrangements are appropriate for anyone until we get a system with better checks and balances that prioritizes a ward's civil liberties and is the least restrictive to them as possible. On the other hand, if you have a loved one who is incapacitated and vulnerable to being exploited by other people, you probably want to put them into a guardianship or conservatorship to protect them from other people taking that kind of control. This system funnels well-intentioned people into taking more control over someone else's life than anyone should have over anybody, because sometimes it is the best option, and it shouldn't be. The sick reality of this is, as much as Wendy's guardianship is a problem, the best chance Wendy's family had at ensuring her well-being was by taking a guardianship over her themselves before Wells Fargo could ever even think of freezing her accounts, which means as soon as her health first started to deteriorate, before they even had any clear idea about what her deteriorating health would even mean for her. And that's pretty dystopian, because as well-intentioned as her family might have been, who's to say that they too wouldn't eventually have become corrupted by the amount of power that they were taking over Wendy? It very much seems like Wendy would have rather had a family member as her guardian than a third party that she doesn't know. But just because a guardian is a family member and they care about their ward doesn't mean that they know what they're doing in terms of their loved one's best interest all the time. They can overstep just as easily as a professional guardian can. No one should have the amount of power over a person that a guardian can have over their ward, but the least of all evils is still a preferable option. At least with Wendy and with Brittany, there are enough eyes on this that the courts are probably going to be more considerate in their decision-making and how they oversee these cases. Wendy's guardianship will probably get more oversight than the average case, and with any future trials regarding the alleged abuse of Brittany's conservatorship, there will be a huge amount of pressure onto those courts to actually help Brittany achieve some sort of justice. But this issue affects countless people, and I do mean literally countless in that we don't even know the number of guardianships currently active in the US. So as bad as Wendy's and Brittany's situations might occasionally get, they're still never gonna represent the worst of the problem, because the worst examples are never gonna get this kind of spotlight. So I really do hope that Brittany's situation and Wendy's situation and the documentaries that have been made about them, even though I know Brittany didn't really approve of a lot of the documentaries made about her, I hope that it at least brings enough awareness toward this issue that something gets done about it at like a legislative level. Because just trying to pick apart every individual case of guardianship or conservatorship abuse is not really gonna do that much in the long term, because every case can be abusive in its own unique way, and the only way we can really stop that is through regulation. And so that's kind of all I have to say on the matter for right now. I do recommend the Lifetime series. I also just recommend looking into the overall laws for these kinds of arrangements, because at some point, that is where this discussion needs to move, but that's it.